Um, Someone is smirking right now. Not the smirk of someone who has won something or who has gotten away with something or who is looking down at something from the elevated and superior position that some smirks express in the confident and looking down form of a smirk that belongs to someone who believes they have the upper position in whatever specific situation. The smirk is the expression of a completely different smirk in the specific and particular form of someone who has just been caught by something they were not expecting, in the arriving and surprising form of something that found them before they had oriented their expecting toward the specific thing that arrived, and that produced the smirk in the involuntary and delighted form of someone who encountered something that was more than they anticipated and whose more than anticipated quality produced the smirk before the producing was decided on as the appropriate response to encountering something extraordinary that they were not expecting to be extraordinary before the encountering showed them that it was that something is you. Virgo, this reading has 4 layers. Stay for every single one because the 4th layer contains what the smirk is the surface expression of in the deeper and more significant form that the smirk is pointing toward, but that this reading is going to name in the direct and complete form that the smirk itself cannot fully express. For the specific Virgo, this reading found, which is you. Virgo, my beautiful Virgo, someone is smirking because of you, and it is the best kind of smirk that a person can produce in the involuntary and delighted form of someone who has been caught by something extraordinary that they were not expecting. Welcome, and stay with every word. The first layer, and this one is about the expecting that was not met in the specific and significant form of what this person was expecting before you arrived as the not what they expected. That produced the smirk in the involuntary and delighted form that the title is naming as the specific and real expression of someone who encountered what they were not expecting and loved it. Because understanding the expecting that was not met is what makes the not meeting of it. Make sense? In the specific and proportionate form of something that surprised because it was more than the expecting was expecting. In the particular and accessible form of what more means. When it is used accurately rather than atmospherically about the specific Virgo, this reading found they were expecting a type in the specific and categorical form of someone who approaches a new person with a mental framework already assembled before the encountering begins in the this is probably who this is form of someone who has encountered enough people to have developed the frameworks that organize the new people into the existing categories before the new person has had the opportunity to reveal themselves as the specific and uncategorizable person that they actually are, rather than the category the framework had assembled for them before the revealing began. The framework said one thing about who the Virgo was likely to be in the specific and categorical form of the type the framework had assembled from the available surface information before the Virgo had revealed the specific and uncategorizable form of who they actually are underneath the surface that the framework was reading before the reading went deeper into the actual person. That the surface was the surface of, and then you revealed yourself, not deliberately, not in the strategic and managing form of someone who is presenting a version of themselves that is calculated to produce a specific response in the person receiving it in the performed and directed form of someone who knows what they are doing and who is doing it deliberately for the specific effect they want to produce in the person they are presenting to, simply in the specific and particular form of someone who was being who they are in the ordinary and unperformed way of someone who was not thinking about the framework or what the framework had assembled as the type they were likely to be before the being who they are revealed the actual person rather than the type. The framework had prepared for, in the categorical and pre-revealing form of someone who had not yet encountered the specific and uncategorizable Virgo, that the simply being produced as the not what they expected, that the smirk is the expression of the second layer. Stay with me, because this layer is where the smirk gets specific in the what exactly surprised them form of the more than expected quality that the Virgo is simply being produced in the person who encountered it and whose framework could not contain it in the categorical and pre-assembled form that had been waiting for a type and received something uncategorizable. Instead, Spirit is showing me three specific things that surprised this person about the specific Virgo this reading found. And I want to name all three in the specific and direct form that the naming deserves for the Virgo who has been producing these things without knowing that the producing was happening in the visible and surprising form that another person has been encountering. And that has been producing the smirk in the involuntary and delighted form that this reading is about. Whew. The first thing that surprised them is the depth in the specific and unexpected form of someone who said something or responded to something or handled something in the ordinary flow of an ordinary interaction. That revealed a depth of understanding or feeling or perspective that the framework had not assembled as a likely quality of the type. It had categorized the Virgo as, before the depth became visible in the ordinary interaction. That was the container for the revealing of the depth that produced the first surprise in the person who encountered it, before their framework had predicted it as a quality of the type it was expecting. The depth hit them somewhere specific, in the chest or the stomach, or the specific and particular place where things that are more than expected land in the body of the person encountering the more than expected, in the ordinary flow of something that was not supposed to contain the depth that the Virgo simply being put into it without knowing that the depth was going somewhere. In the receiving and smirking person, that the Virgo did not anticipate it was going. The second thing that surprised them is the humor in the specific and particular form of something that arrived in the space between you without being directed there deliberately, in the performing humor form of someone who is trying to be funny for the specific effect of producing laughter or lightness in the person they are being funny for. The arriving form of something that emerged naturally from the specific and particular way. The Virgo sees things and names what they see in the specific and acute form of a perspective that finds the specific angle on the ordinary thing that makes the ordinary thing suddenly funnier or lighter or more absurd than it appeared before the Virgo named the specific angle they found on the ordinary thing that the framework had not assembled as a likely quality of the type. It was expecting. The humor landed differently than expected humor lands, in the spontaneous and unperformed form of something that arrived before anyone was ready for it to arrive, and that produced in the person receiving it the specific and involuntary form of laughter or lightness or smirk that things produce when they arrive before the defenses have had time to assess them as the appropriate response, before allowing the response in the undefended and involuntary form that the humor produced in the smirking person who was not expecting to find the specific and acute humor that the Virgo produces without trying to produce it. And the third thing that surprised them is the most significant of the three. In the specific and producing the smirk form of the quality, that the depth and the humor were the surface expressions of, in the revealed and visible form, of a deeper and more significant quality that the framework had not assembled as a likely quality of the type. It was expecting before the encountering revealed what the simply being produced in the person doing the simply being, which is you, Virgo. The third thing is the ease in the specific and rare form of someone who is completely comfortable in their own specific and particular form of being themselves without the managing or the performing or the adjusted and presented exterior that most people bring to the encountering of a new person. who they want to make a particular impression on. In the performing and directed form of someone who is not simply being, but is being for an audience. In the specific and managing form of someone whose being is being shaped by the awareness of being watched. The Virgo was not shaped by the watching. In the specific and extraordinary form of someone who was simply being, even while being watched, in the ease and comfort of someone who did not adjust their being for the watching, because the simply being is the only form. The Virgo has, in the authentic and unadjusted form of someone who does not have a performing version that is substantially different from the simply being version that the watching person encountered and found extraordinary, in the smirk producing form of something more than they expected. Whew. The third layer, and I need you to stay with me for this one, because this layer is about what the smirk means beyond the surface expression of someone who encountered something more than they expected and loved it. In the involuntary and delighted form of a smirk that arrived before the decision to smirk had been made by the person whose face it arrived on. The smirk means something is changing in the interior of the person smirking, in the specific and significant form of a framework that is being updated in real time by the encountering of something. The framework was not assembled to accommodate in the categorical and pre-revealing form of a type that turned out to be a specific and uncategorizable person, rather than the type the framework expected. And when a framework is updated in the real time and encountering form of something more than expected, the updating produces consequences in the interior of the person whose framework is being updated by the encountering that revealed the more than expected in the specific and smirk producing form that this reading is about. The first consequence is curiosity in the specific and activated form of someone whose framework has been disrupted by something that did not fit, and who is now curious about what else does not fit in the framework that was assembled before the encountering. That revealed the not fitting in the smirk producing form of the more than expected that the Virgos simply being produced. In the person watching, the second consequence is wanting in the specific and arriving form of someone who encountered something more than they expected and who now wants more of the more, in the specific and building form of a wanting that the framework update produced as the natural and arriving result of encountering something extraordinary that the framework had not predicted, and that the person is now oriented toward in the wanting and moving form of someone whose curiosity has become wanting in the natural progression from the framework disruption to the curiosity to the wanting that the smirk was the surface expression of. In all three of its stages, they want more of you. In the specific and arriving and building form of the wanting that the smirk was pointing toward as the deeper and more significant thing, that the surface expression was the visible form of in the involuntary and delighted and entirely real smirk that this reading found in the field around your situation and is now delivering to you as the specific and real thing that is happening right now in the interior of the person. This reading is about within the next 72 hours, the curiosity and the wanting that the framework disruption produced are going to produce something external in the visible and arriving form of the wanting becoming action in the specific and moving form of someone who has been in the curiosity and is now in the wanting and who is about to be in the moving toward the specific Virgo who's simply being produced the smirk that started all three stages within 72 hours. Something arrives from this person in the specific and moving form of the wanting becoming visible in the external and arriving way of something that was interior and is now moving into the exterior and available dimension of what can be received. By the specific Virgo, this reading found within 72 hours of right now. Watch for this today, in the ordinary flow of the ordinary hours. The first sign of the wanting moving from the interior of the smirking person into the exterior and visible dimension may already be in motion in the specific and barely visible form of something that has just started moving toward the Virgo within 72 hours. Watch for this tomorrow. The first concrete evidence of the moving having begun in the specific intangible form of something you can point to and say, something is different today. In the space between us, something has shifted in the direction that the smirk was pointing toward as the wanting moved from interior to exterior in the 72-hour window. This reading is naming, and watch for this by the end of the 72 hours. The full and unmistakable arrival of what the smirk was the beginning of in the specific and finally visible form of the wanting that the framework disruption produced as its natural and arriving consequence for the specific Virgo whose simply being disrupted the framework and produced the smirk and the curiosity and the wanting that is now arriving within 72 hours. Whew. The fourth layer, the most personal, the one I almost did not include because it says something directly that the Virgo may not fully have access to in the specific and interior form of something that is true about them, but that they have not yet fully named or claimed in the complete and settled form of something known and owned, rather than suspected and partially believed in the uncertain and unconfirmed form of something the Virgo senses about themselves without the external confirmation that this reading is now delivering as the fourth and most important layer, I feel a question forming in you right now as the fourth layer arrives, and I want to name it before it speaks. The question is not about this person or the smirk or the 72 hours and what they contain. The question is, why did they not expect this from me? In the specific and interior form of a Virgo who has been in the situation long enough to have a sense of how they are being perceived by the people in the situation and who is now receiving the information. That the perception was different from what they expected the perception to be in the framework had a type form of a perception that was categorical rather than specific before the simply being revealed the specific that disrupted the categorical and produced the smirk. I want to answer that question directly in the most honest form available. They did not expect this from you because you do not lead with what you are. In the specific and particular form of a Virgo who does not announce the depth and the humor and the ease before the encountering has produced them, in the natural and unperformed form of simply being, that does not announce its qualities. Before the encountering reveals them as the qualities they are, in the specific and particular form of someone whose surface does not fully predict what the depth contains, and that gap between what the surface suggests and what the depth contains is the specific and smirk producing thing about the Virgo this reading found that produces the framework disruption. And the curiosity and the wanting and the 72-hour arrival of what the smirk was, the beginning of you are more than your surface suggests, in the specific and extraordinary form of someone whose depth exceeds what the surface predicts and whose exceeding is the specific and smirk producing quality that disrupts frameworks and produces curiosity and becomes wanting. In the people who encounter the gap between the surface and what the depth contains, in the specific and involuntary smirk form of something that arrives before the defenses have had time to assess whether the smirk is the appropriate response to the encountering of someone who is more than their surface suggests. I want to give you something before this closes. In the permission form that the more than my surface suggests Virgo, reading this specifically needs, before the 72 hours and what they contain, permission to stop being surprised. When people are surprised by you in the specific and smirk producing form of encountering something more than they were expecting. From the surface of the person, that turned out to have a depth that the surface did not predict in the framework disrupting and smirk producing way that this reading has been describing as what is happening right now in the interior of the person smirking at the specific Virgo this reading found. Stop being surprised that you produce this in people who encounter you when the encountering goes past the surface into the depth that the surface does not predict. You produce this because you are this, in the specific and particular form of someone whose depth exceeds their surface, in the extraordinary and smirk producing way that this reading is naming as the specific and real quality of the Virgo it found. Whew. You are protected and seen in the full and smirk producing form of someone whose depth exceeds what the surface predicts and who is now within 72 hours of the wanting that the framework disruption produced in the person who encountered the gap between the surface and the depth, and who is now moving in the direction of the specific Virgo, whose simply being was more than they expected and that they loved in the involuntary and delighted and entirely real form of a smirk that arrived before the permission to smirk had been given. Take gentle care of yourself, my beautiful Virgo. Someone is smirking because of you right now, and within 72 hours, the smirk becomes something more in the moving and arriving form of what the smirk was always pointing toward as its natural and building consequence. Drop a comment below and tell me, has someone ever told you that you were not what they expected? Because if they have, this reading was made for you specifically. And if this landed somewhere real, subscribe, because there is more coming for the Virgo who is more than their surface suggests.